So first, I think it's important to emphasize that there are different definitions, some of which are so broad that they're almost meaningless. So let me tell you how I understand political Islam. Political Islam are movements that believe that Islam must be reinstated as the all-encompassing framework of all aspects of life, including the political, and that the means to achieve this objective are through politics. I think the best example for a political Islam movement are the Muslim Brothers, because that is basically the idea that they have championed through the years. That is basically their flagship idea, that there was a time in history where everything in Muslim societies was regulated in accordance with Islamic norms. And then, with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, and even before, that time in history has ended. And the only way to remedy the misfortune of Muslim societies in our day and age is to return to those old glorious days, where the law is the law of Allah, where the norms are the norms of Allah, and nothing but the laws of Allah and nothing but the norms of Allah is legitimate. Now, we have to understand that it is not as if Muslim societies today or Arab Muslim societies today are radically in contradiction with these ideas. If you read the amended Egyptian constitution of Anwar Sadat, it stated very clearly that laws must be in line with Sharia. So in that sense, it came into the demands of the Islamists. The problem is that from the point of view of political Islam, not a single norm, not a single code can breach the norms of Allah. If Allah said that you shouldn't drink alcohol, then you shouldn't drink alcohol. If Allah said no to abortions, then abortions are strictly prohibited. If Allah said no to gay marriage or to gay sex, then obviously no one can allow something that Allah banned. And further, if Allah permitted something, if Allah made something permissible, no human being can say that it is impermissible. So if Allah said that a man should be allowed to the extent that he's able to marry 4 wives, then human beings cannot legislate that it is illegal. Basically, the concept of the political Islam movement is that anything that Allah legitimized is legitimate, and anything that he delegitimized is illegitimate. So to the extent that there is even one law in Egypt which breaches the norms regulated by Sharia, if there is even one such law, then the country defies God. And I have to say this makes perfect sense in one way. If you accept that there is God and that Prophet Muhammad was his final prophet and messenger, and that the Quran is the holy book of God, then it doesn't make sense to accept some of the laws and negate other laws. I mean, either you accept it as your framework or you don't. This is the basic philosophy of the Muslim Brothers. Through the years, the brothers had to face the question of whether or not they engage and participate with a political system that doesn't abide by the norms that they hold so dear. And I think it was the 80s where they reached the decision that it is permissible for them, it is beneficiary for them to take part in an electoral democracy, that doesn't abide by the codes that they adhere to. Obviously, they've done that already during the 30s and the 40s, but there was a period of loss of faith in the democratic system, and it was regained during the 80s. So the Muslim Brothers' theory is that today is, or was after the 80s, that it is permissible to take part in elections, even if the elections lead to a parliament that doesn't exclusively and comprehensively abide by God's laws. But there is a bigger issue, and I think that is the issue that possibly needs to be addressed or should be the focal point of attention. The Muslim Brothers' understanding of democracy is that the origins of Western democracy can be found in Islam, and that democracy is the Western way of practicing the Islamic principle of Shura, which is mentioned in the Quran twice explicitly, and in the traditions and elsewhere in the Quran in less explicit way. The Muslim understanding, the Muslim Brothers' understanding is that when God commanded Muslims to abide by the principle of Shura or consultation, that means that is the equivalent of the way Westerners practice democracy today in great many ways. First and foremost, that according to the Muslim Brothers, because God commanded human beings to practice Shura, leaders are only legitimate to the extent that they are elected in universal, fair, and frequent elections. That their regime is transparent. They respect the will of the people if the people decide that they should leave office. It is also the firm belief of the Muslim Brothers that God commanded Muslims not only to abide by Shura in this narrow electoral sense, but also to practice freedom of speech and other human freedoms. And that practicing those freedoms is not just something that Muslims can do, it is something that they must do. It is something that God commanded them to do. And in this sense, the fact that Western nations, and also the fact that Israel, are more democratic or has been more democratic for such a long time, while Arab states are not, is not just an offense against democracy in the simple sense, it is also an offense against Islam. Because if God commanded Muslims to live in a democratic societies and they do not, then by not being democratic, they're also not being good Muslims. So far, so good. It seems as if the brothers have a very clear and coherent theory of democracy. And let me explain where I think the problem lies. The reference for all of this, what legitimizes all these ideas from the Muslim Brothers' point of view, is their understanding of God's commands. That is, democracy is something that has to be practiced. Leaders must be elected. Freedom of speech must be respected because this is what God ordered. Democracy is part of Islam. Therefore, from the Muslim Brothers' point of view, it also makes perfect sense that you can legislate in a Muslim democracy only on those issues on which God did not legislate. And here is why this makes sense. It makes sense because if we accept that the premise of democracy, that the source of democracy's legitimacy is God's commands, if we accept that, then it doesn't make sense to disobey God's commands on other issues. Therefore, according to the Muslim Brothers, a democratically elected parliament in a Muslim country cannot legitimize the drinking of alcohol. A democratically elected parliament in a Muslim country, one that abides by the principle of Shura, cannot legitimize, for example, abortions. It cannot delegalize marrying four wives. So democracy is good so long as God's laws are abided by. That is the basic principle of the Muslim Brothers. This is their theory of democracy. It is just as in the West, except that in a Muslim democracy, in a Muslim Brothers democracy, you cannot legislate against God's commands. Now, if you tell a Muslim brother that this theory is not very democratic, he would tell you, or she would tell you, if she's a Muslim sister, she would tell you, or he would tell you, he's a Muslim brother, that it is not really fair to argue that their theory is non-democratic. And they would present the following argument, which I have to say is a very appealing argument. They would say, look, in a Western democracy, parliaments also cannot legislate on anything as they deem fit. For example, it is possible in the United States, which most people will argue is a democracy, it is possible there that the Congress, both houses of Congress, legislate, approve through legislation, through a very broad margin, a piece of legislation, which later the Supreme Court, which is basically 9 justices, will decide with a 5-4 majority that piece of legislation is unconstitutional. And everyone will accept that these are the rules of the game. The Congress legislated, and everyone was happy there. But the Supreme Court found that this piece of legislation, this act of legislation, is unconstitutional, and that's the end of that. So Muslim brothers will say, where is the difference between, theoretically speaking, between an Egyptian parliament where it is established that the Quran is the constitution, or let's say broadly that the Quran and the prophetic traditions, any of God's decrees and the Prophet's decrees are the constitution. Sharia is the premise for all legislation, and if Parliament legislates in a way that the Supreme Court of Egypt or some other panel will find is unconstitutional, that is, it negates, it counters the Quran, then the law will be declared unconstitutional, and that will be the end of that. What is wrong with this theory, they say? Where is the difference between such a system and the American system? And I have to say, this is something I elaborated quite a bit on in my book, Scientific and Political Freedom in Islam, in more systematic fashion. But I have to say, just in the context of our conversation, that there is a lot of sense. Like this theory, this way of presenting things by the Muslim brothers makes perfect sense, save one crucial issue. And here is that one crucial issue. Obviously, those justices in the United States who decide if something is constitutional or not, they are indirectly elected by the people, because it's the president who decides who the justices will be. He is elected by the electors, and the electors are elected by the people. So in the end, those justices represent the popular will. What do the Muslim brothers have in mind in their hypothetical state? What do they have in mind as the panel that will decide whether a piece of legislation is compatible with the Quran or whether it is not? What will that be? Well, here's the thing. I've been reading Muslim brothers literature from the 30s to the early 2000s that dealt with the issues we have been discussing. That is the issue of who should have the authority to decide whether certain legislation is compatible with the Quran or not. And it's very interesting, and I hardly think it's a coincidence that the brothers neglect to fully answer that question. Neglect to fully answer that question because they understand if they say that those justices, that legal panel that will have the full authority, should be indirectly or directly elected by the people, then they describe a democracy, not a liberal democracy, but nevertheless a democracy. But in a situation whereby this panel would be comprised of religious scholars, of ulama, who will be elected by other religious scholars, the name for such a regime is not a democracy. The name for a regime of that kind is a theocracy. And the reason why I'm not splitting hairs here, this is actually a very crucial issue. The reason why the brothers avoided answering it is that they wanted to be able to play on both fields. That is, to have an appeal with people who are very eager to see Egypt as a theocracy, but also to have an appeal with people who want a more Islamic Egypt, but nevertheless a democratic one. That is, basically, they wanted to appeal both to those who wish Egypt to be some variation of Iran and those who wanted it to be some variation of conservative European countries. I was very eager to see them once and for all in power in Egypt because I figured that once they are in power, they would have to answer the question, And then they would realize, and the Egyptian public will realize, that you have to make a choice. You have to make a choice between a theocracy and a democracy. You cannot have both. And I have to say, it is rather interesting that when they passed the constitution in Egypt, their spelling power was very short, but they did manage to pass a constitution. And I thought it was very interesting that even in that constitution, they managed to avoid answering that question. They left it open for the future. But why did we have millions of Egyptians marching on the streets of Cairo and elsewhere? We had millions of Egyptians, including liberals, who marched there because they were quite convinced that given the chance, that if they are enough time in power, then what the Muslim Brothers will do is lead Egypt towards the path of becoming a theocracy. And I have to say, Egyptian leaders, Egyptian liberals, they faced a rather uncomfortable dilemma. They had to choose between a military regime, because everyone, I think, realized that crowning Sisi would end up with the establishment of a military regime. So they had to choose between establishing a military regime, a form of authoritarian regime that they knew well, that was the evil they knew, or accepting the gradual encroachment of theocratic norms on Egyptian society. And they finally did choose the evil that they knew, and that is what we see in Egypt over the past 4 or 5 years, the evil that the Egyptian liberals knew, a non-democratic regime led by a strong man that nevertheless is strong enough to fend off the Islamist threat. Just a final word. So I guess a very crucial question is it possible to have a democracy with a strong political Islam movement as part of that democracy? The answer to that question is yes, but under one condition, that political Islam movement does not enjoy a majority. Because if it enjoys a majority, it would ultimately lead the country to a theocratic regime. If it doesn't, it may just have the effect of leading the country to be more conservative, more Islamic, more religious, but not in a way that doesn't allow popular vote to express itself and doesn't allow regime change. And we spoke a lot about Egypt, but Tunisia, I think, and the events that took place in Tunisia ever since the Arab Spring, they prove that political Islam can have different faces and can function differently in democratic systems, so long as one thing is maintained, and that one thing is their acceptance of a non-Sharia abiding regime. Political Islam can take part in liberal democracy so long as it doesn't win an absolute majority. That is, look, you have political movements in Israel whose dream would be to see here a regime, a society that is governed by the laws of God, by rabbinical law. And they take active part in Israeli politics. The difference is that they do not comprise more than 15 to 20% of the Israeli parliament. You have in Indonesia political parties. Indonesia, the largest Muslim country in the world, you have political parties that are Islamic, that even preach variations of political Islam. But they haven't been able to win an absolute majority. And that has also been the case in Tunisia. That is, political Islam movements, they want one thing, ultimately, in the end. But wanting that one thing shouldn't make it impossible for them to participate in politics so long as they don't get the one thing that they actually want. Well, Turkey is a very interesting example. What a lot of people do not know is that Erdogan managed to assert his control over Turkish politics only after he went that extra mile that Arab Islamists at the time were not willing to take. Erdogan basically renounced all the demands for a Sharia-led government and Sharia-led society. And he was as clear-cut and unequivocal in renouncing those old concepts that Erbakan and other Turkish Islamists preach for. And that was how it was possible for him to take power in Turkey. Now, a lot of people ask, so where does Erdogan really want Turkey to go, given full authority, facing no opposition from the public, from the judiciary, will he still abide by his commitment to a different face of Islamism? He says he would, but knowing that this is Erdogan and how capricious he is, I mean, that is not necessarily going to be the case. Nevertheless, there is today a great disparity between the political views, the ideology of the Egyptian Muslim Brothers, and that of the Turkish Islamists. And note that since 2016, the Tunisian Islamists have also gone that extra mile that Erdogan has gone through already in the late 90s. And now they are not preaching, they are not insisting on a Sharia-led society. Well, that is a whole new topic, and I will only say two things. A, it's very difficult and probably not very analytically constructive to discuss European Islam as a whole. European Muslims are so diverse. There is so much that brings them apart, aside of the basic belief in God and His final prophet. But it is not possible really to discuss them as one coherent political group, not even on a national basis, not even if we discuss British Muslims or German Muslims. There is just too much disunity to make such analysis credible. It is true that among first, second, and third generations of European Muslims, there are individuals who find integration more difficult. We also need to be cautious that it is not that obvious what we mean when we say integration. I think that we see very little Islamic politics in Europe. Maybe that will change in 20 years or 30 years or 40 years, but at the moment, those Europeans of Muslim faith who do well in politics are actually secular, or if not secular, then at best traditionalists. You have very little Islamic influence in European parliaments, in European politics, and I would speculate that could change, as we said, like in 20, 30 years. But right now, Islamic politics is almost redundant in the broader map of European politics. Some of the states are vibrant democracies. Some are challenged democracies, and some are not democratic at all. And I think, of all of these, I think the greatest shame, in a sense, is Egypt, because they had a unique historical opportunity to change the face of their society, to drastically and dramatically transform it. The Arab Spring brought them such a wonderful opportunity, and Egyptian society could not find in itself the forces of revival and the forces of renewal. And that, I think, is extremely unfortunate, considering what Egypt can contribute to the region and to the world. And my guess is that, just by very crude and maybe it would sound even called calculated analysis, my guess is that Egypt's worst days are still ahead of it, because I don't think it makes much sense to think that the Muslim Brothers and Islamists at large have said the last word. A movement that comprised some half of the Egyptian population didn't just disappear. And the moment will come, maybe when Sisi is weakened, maybe when he's gone, maybe for another reason, but the moment will come that these forces will resurface. And when they resurface, I can tell you one thing is going to be different. They are not going to buy the idea that they can achieve anything through electoral processes. They bought this idea. Now they were disillusioned. Now they understand that the only way to make change is using violence, applying force. And therefore, I repeat my rather grave and grim statement that I fear that Egypt's worst days are still ahead of it.